We assume the beginning of our story was a gentle dawn, a soft awakening of consciousness in a garden of peace. But the truth is far more violent and far more profound. Before the ticking of the cosmic clock, before the rise and fall of empires, and before history dared to write its first sentence, there was only a suffocating, absolute nothingness. Then, in a cataclysm of divine will, God spoke. And the universe didn't just emerge, it exploded into existence, light shattering the ancient darkness like a hammer through glass. The seas were ripped apart to reveal the land. The mountains were heaved upward from the depths of the boiling waters, and the stars were pinned against the velvet void of the cosmos. This was not a passive event. It was the architecture of reality being forged in fire and sound. At the pinnacle of this chaotic symphony, God did something different, something intimate. He didn't just speak man into existence from a distance. He came down. The Creator knelt in the dirt, his hands working the raw, unformed dust of the ground, sculpting the intricate biology of the first human. This shell, this vessel of clay, lay motionless until God breathed into his nostrils, and with that single rush of divine air, the chest of Adam heaved, his eyes snapped open, and the first consciousness looked back at its maker. He was free, living in a frequency of existence we can no longer comprehend, a reality where there was no fear, no suffering, and no shadow of death. But perfection is a fragile thing, and a lie can travel faster than the truth. The architecture of Eden was designed for delight, a paradise where God walked among the trees, the atmosphere thick with a presence that mankind has been starving for ever since. Yet Adam was incomplete in his solitude, a lone intelligence in a world of pairs. Seeing this, God induced a deep, coma-like sleep upon the man, reaching into his very side to extract a rib, a piece of his own structural essence, to engineer the woman. When Adam awoke, the recognition was instant and primal, a cry of joy, realizing that she was bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, a counterpart that made the picture complete. They existed in a state of naked vulnerability that carried no shame, a psychological freedom that is alien to us now. But they were being watched, deep within the foliage, lurking in the shadows of the two great trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. An ancient intelligence waited. The serpent, the adversary, did not come with a sword, but with a question, a subtle twisting of reality designed to fracture trust. He approached the woman not with a direct attack, but with a seed of doubt, whispering, "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of any tree'?" It was a psychological siege. Eve, standing before the forbidden fruit, saw that it was beautiful, and the serpent pressed his advantage, promising that death was a lie, and that godhood was within her grasp, that her eyes would be opened to a spectrum of reality God was hoarding for himself. The moment she took the fruit, the universe shifted. She ate, and she gave it to Adam, and he ate. And in that split second, the neural pathways of humanity were rewired. The promise of the serpent came true in the most horrific way possible. Their eyes were opened, but not to glory. They saw their own nakedness, the sudden, crushing weight of exposure and vulnerability. Shame, a cold and foreign emotion, flooded their systems for the first time. They scrambled to hide among the trees, terrified of the very footsteps they used to welcome. When the voice of God thundered through the garden, asking, "Where are you?" it was not a question of location, but of condition. The interrogation that followed was the first trial in history, a cascade of blame where Adam pointed to Eve and Eve pointed to the serpent. But the verdict was inescapable. Sin had breached the containment of Eden. The curse was pronounced, weaving pain into childbirth, sweat into labor, and entropy into the very soil of the earth. The garden was closed, the gates barred, and humanity was exiled into a hostile world where thorns choked the harvest and death became the inevitable horizon. Yet, even in the sentencing, there was a cryptic whisper of hope, a prophecy that the seed of the woman would one day crush the head of the serpent, a long-game strategy for redemption that had begun the moment the fall occurred. Outside the sanctuary of Eden, the reality of the fallen world began to manifest in the lineage of Adam. Eve conceived, birthing a son she named Cain, a man of the earth who wrestled sustenance from the cursed ground. Later came Abel, a shepherd who walked a different path. The contrast between the two brothers was not just in their professions, but in the orientation of their souls. When the appointed time came to present offerings to the Creator, Cain brought the fruit of the ground, a product of his own sweating and striving. Abel, however, understood something deeper. He brought the firstborn of his flock, the fattest and purest, a sacrifice that cost a life, acknowledging the gravity of their separation from God. The divine reaction was immediate and polarizing. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, seeing the heart behind the blood. But on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. The rejection shattered Cain. His face fell, twisting into a mask of fury and humiliation. God, seeing the storm gathering in Cain's mind, offered a warning that echoes through the human condition to this day. If you do not do what is right, sin lies at the door. It crouches like a beast, and its desire is to rule over you. But you must master it. Cain did not master the beast. He let it in. The resentment festered, turning his brother from family into a target, a shadow that reminded him of his own inadequacy. He orchestrated a moment of isolation, inviting Abel out to the field, away from the eyes of their parents, away from the safety of the camp. The atmosphere in that field was heavy with unspoken malice. When they were alone, the hatred that had been boiling in Cain's veins erupted. He rose up against his own flesh and blood, striking him down, and for the first time in the history of the cosmos, human blood splashed onto the soil. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the voice of God demanding, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's response was cold, a deflection of supreme arrogance. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" But the earth itself was a witness. God declared that the voice of Abel's blood was crying out from the ground, a scream for justice that could not be ignored. The judgment was severe. Cain was cursed from the earth, destined to be a fugitive and a wanderer, driven by a restlessness that no settlement could cure. Terrified that this vulnerability would lead to his own death, Cain pleaded for mercy, and God, in a complex act of judgment and preservation, placed a mark on him so that no one who found him would kill him. Cain walked away from the presence of the Lord, settling in the land of Nod, east of Eden, building cities and birthing civilizations. But the darkness in the human heart was only just beginning to spread. As generations multiplied, the infection of sin mutated and expanded. The descendants of Cain prospered in skill and city building, but their technological advancement was matched by their moral decay. Wickedness did not just exist, it became the dominant culture. Violence spread across the earth like a plague, and every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. The connection with the divine had been severed, replaced by a monstrous autonomy where men lived for their own glory and their own appetites. It reached a tipping point where God, looking down at the ruin of his masterpiece, felt a profound sorrow. The text says he grieved that he had made man on the earth. The corruption was absolute. The biological and spiritual integrity of the world compromised beyond repair. In the face of this overwhelming darkness, God made a terrifying decision. He would wipe the slate clean. "My spirit shall not strive with man forever," he declared, determining to destroy all flesh, to unmake the creation that had turned against him. But in this ocean of corruption, there was a single anomaly. One man who swam against the current of his age. His name was Noah, and he found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The countdown to the decreation of the world had begun, and the heavens were about to break open in a way that would wash history away. The supreme irony of the first murder is that it was born from an act of worship. Cain didn't kill Abel over money or land or a woman. He killed him because of religion. He killed him because he brought his best efforts to God, his hard work, his sweat, the fruit of the ground, and it wasn't enough. This reveals a terrifying truth about the human ego. We can handle being wrong, but we cannot handle being rejected when we think we are right. We live in a world that tells us, do your best and you will be rewarded. But the story of Cain shatters that meritocracy. It suggests that the how matters less than the heart, and that performing the right rituals with the wrong spirit is more dangerous than doing nothing at all. Consider the mark of Cain. We often speak of it as a curse, a brand of shame. But look closer. It was actually a divine protection. Even after committing the worst crime imaginable, fratricide, God did not abandon Cain to mob justice. He protected him. This forces us to ask a binary question that defines our own worldview. Do we want a God of pure mathematical justice who strikes down every wrong immediately? Or do we want a God of mercy who protects even the guilty? If you choose justice, you condemn yourself, for we all have a Cain inside us. If you choose mercy, you must accept that monsters will be allowed to live and build cities. Which creates the world you actually want to live in, safe but merciless, or gracious but dangerous. This was only the first fracture. The violence of Cain was a single drop of blood. Soon, the entire world will be drowning in it. The skies are darkening, and a storm is coming that will erase everything we know. Join us in the next chapter, because the water is rising, and the ark is the only way out. We tend to remember the Great Flood as a nursery rhyme, a charming story of a bearded old man, a wooden boat, and pairs of smiling animals bobbing gently on the ocean. But this is a sanitization of the most terrifying event in human history. The true story of the deluge is not a fable of zoology. It is a narrative of decreation. It is the moment the architect of the universe decided that the structure was so rotten, so infested with the cancer of violence, that the only solution was to burn the blueprints and wash the foundation with salt water. The world before the flood was not simply bad. It was a nightmare of industrial-scale wickedness. The text tells us that the wickedness of man was exceedingly great, a description that implies a sophisticated, unrelenting dedication to evil. Imagine a civilization where every inhibition is removed, where the strong devour the weak, not out of necessity, but out of sport. The earth was filled with violence, a saturation point where the very soil was crying out under the weight of spilled blood. In this era of darkness, humanity had achieved a terrifying unity of purpose, total rebellion. They lived for their own glory, pursuing a self-deification that severed the final thread connecting them to their Creator. The Spirit of God, which had hovered over the waters at creation, now looked down at a species that had become a monstrous distortion of its original design. The decision was made in the heavy silence of eternity. I will wipe from the face of the earth every living being. It was an eviction notice for the entire planet. Yet, in this global asylum of corruption, there was one deviation from the norm. One man who refused to conform to the entropy of his age. Noah. He wasn't a king, a warrior, or a mystic. He was a man who simply walked with God, while the rest of the world ran toward oblivion. The call he received was absolute and terrifyingly specific. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. This was not a suggestion. It was a survival strategy for a coming apocalypse. God's instructions were precise. 3 decks, sealed with pitch inside and out. A floating fortress designed to withstand the collapse of the atmosphere. I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life. The scope of the judgment was total. Everything that breathed, everything that moved, everything that existed outside the wooden walls of this vessel would be erased. For Noah, this wasn't just a construction project, it was a social suicide. To build a massive ocean liner in the middle of a continent, far from any sea, was an act of insanity in the eyes of his peers. The construction of the ark was a grueling marathon of faith that lasted over a century. Visualize the scene. For 100 years, the sound of hammers striking wood echoed across the plains, a rhythmic warning that no one wanted to hear. Noah and his sons dragged massive timbers under the scorching sun, their hands stained black with the pitch used to seal the planks. This substance, this sticky, boiling tar, was the only thing standing between them and the chaotic waters to come. And for 100 years, the world laughed. The text describes a relentless mockery. "Crazy old man," they sneered. "It has never rained. There is no sea here. Why would you need an ark?" They analyzed his madness, debated his delusion, and turned his obedience into a punchline. The concept of rain was foreign to them, the idea of divine judgment laughable. They preached a gospel of continuity, that tomorrow would always be like today, blind to the cliff edge they were sprinting toward. Noah didn't just build. He endured a century of psychological warfare, holding on to a word from a God no one else could hear, building a coffin for a world that thought it was immortal. Then the atmosphere shifted. The impossible began to happen. A silent signal went out into the wild, a frequency that only the animal kingdom could hear. From the horizons they came, not driven by whips, but drawn by a divine homing instinct. 2 by 2, the biodiversity of the ancient world marched toward the ark. Lions, cattle, creeping things, birds of the heavens, a procession of life seeking sanctuary. This should have been the sign that stopped the laughter. This should have been the moment the crowds fell silent and realized that Noah wasn't crazy. But they were too deep in their spiritual coma to wake up. They watched the animals enter, perhaps finding it an entertaining oddity rather than a harbinger of doom. Finally, God gave the command that signaled the end of the era of grace. Enter the ark, you and all your household, for in 7 days I will send rain. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives stepped across the threshold. And then a detail of chilling finality occurred. Noah didn't close the door. He couldn't. The door was too massive, the spiritual weight of the moment too heavy. The scripture records that the Lord shut him in. God himself sealed the vessel. The closing of that door was the sound of a vault locking, a definitive separation between the saved and the condemned. Inside, there was safety. Outside, there was only fate. For 7 days, the ark sat there, sealed, silent. The people outside likely pounded on the wood, jeering, asking if the cruise was about to start. But on the 7th day, the physics of the world unraveled. It didn't just rain. The universe collapsed. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. Massive subterranean oceans erupting from the crust of the earth, while the windows of heaven were opened. It was a hydrodynamic sandwich, water rising from below and hammering from above. The sky turned black, not with night, but with the density of the falling water. The mockery outside turned instantly to screaming. The realization hit them with the force of a tidal wave. The old man was right. They fled to the high ground, scrambling up hills and mountains, their empires and cities dissolving into mud in minutes. They pounded on the door of the ark now, not with laughter, but with the desperate, bloody knuckles of the dying. "Noah, open up! Let us in! Save us!" But the door was shut by a hand that would not open it. The time for choice had expired. For 40 days and 40 nights, the assault continued. The waters rose past the tree lines, past the hills, until even the highest peaks of the ancient mountains were submerged under 20 feet of churning ocean. The silence that fell over the earth was absolute. No birds sang, no beasts roared, no cities hummed. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Birds, livestock, beasts, and all mankind. The planet had been reset to its factory settings, formless, void, and covered in deep water, just as it was in the beginning. Inside the ark, the experience must have been terrifying. A dark, heaving box of wood, tossed by tsunamis, filled with the sounds of thousands of animals and the creaking of timber. For 150 days, the waters prevailed. Noah and his family were suspended in a wooden capsule between a drowned world and a silent heaven, drifting over the graveyards of civilizations. It was a time of waiting, a test of sanity, trusting that the pitch would hold, that the wood wouldn't splinter, and that God hadn't forgotten them in the watery abyss. Then a wind passed over the earth. The waters began to recede, draining back into the fractures of the deep. The ark, guided by an invisible hand, ground to a halt on the rugged slopes of the mountains of Ararat. The windows were opened. Noah sent out a raven, a scavenger bird that flew back and forth, finding no rest. Then he sent a dove, the symbol of peace, which returned because the water was still too high. 7 days later, he sent the dove again, and this time the impossible happened. She returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf in her beak. Life had survived. The photosynthetic engine of the world had restarted. When they finally stepped out of the ark, the world was alien. The geography had changed, the climate was different, and the silence was profound. They were the only humans left on a planet that was once teeming with millions. Noah's first act was not to build a house, but to build an altar. He offered a sacrifice, the smoke rising into the clean, washed air. And God responded with a warrior's promise. He hung his bow in the clouds, not a weapon of war, but a rainbow, a visual treaty. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. The weapon was unstrung, pointed upwards, a promise that while humanity would remain flawed, the earth would never again be destroyed by water. The nightmare was over, but the human heart, the carrier of the original infection, had survived the flood. The story of the flood leaves us with a haunting realization about the nature of salvation. We often view the ark as a vessel of comfort, but in reality, it was a coffin. Noah had to enter the ark and die to the world outside in order to live. He had to accept that everything he knew, his neighbors, his culture, the geography of his childhood, was going to be erased. This leads us to a subversive twist. The water was not just the instrument of judgment, it was the instrument of salvation. The very same water that drowned the wicked was the water that lifted the ark toward the heavens. Judgment and grace were made of the same substance. The only difference was who was inside the shelter and who was exposed to the storm. This mirrors our modern struggle with cancel culture and the irreversible consequences of our actions. We live in an age that demands total purification. We want to wash away the bad people, the bad ideas, the bad history, thinking that if we just destroy enough, we will arrive at utopia. But the flood proves that you can wash the world, but you cannot wash the human heart. Noah stepped off the boat into a pristine, new world, and yet, within chapters, drunkenness and betrayal returned. It suggests that the problem isn't the environment, it's the inhabitant. We are the contamination we are trying to escape. So here is the binary question that the closed door of the ark forces you to answer. Do you believe that safety is found in the majority opinion, standing on the solid ground of what everyone else says is true? Or is safety found in the madness of the minority, locked inside a wooden box that makes no sense until the first drop of rain falls? The world has been washed clean, but the seeds of rebellion were carried in the blood of the survivors. The tower is coming, a structure of human pride so tall it will threaten the heavens themselves. The united language of mankind is about to be weaponized. Subscribe and ring the bell, because the bricks are being baked, the mortar is being mixed, and the next time God comes down, He isn't bringing water, He's bringing confusion. We are taught that unity is the ultimate virtue, that a world without borders, speaking one voice, acting with one mind, is the utopia we should strive for. But the story of Babel reveals a terrifying counter-narrative, that when humanity unites without the divine, it does not create heaven on earth, it creates a concentration camp of the soul. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a scarred planet and a traumatized population. The survivors of the deluge carried a genetic memory of the drowning, a haunting fear of the water that could rise again to swallow them whole. As the descendants of Noah multiplied, they did not spread out as commanded. Instead, they clumped together, driven by a desperate, neurotic need for control. They migrated from the rugged mountains of Ararat down into the fertile, flat expanse of the plain of Shinar. Here, the horizon was endless, a blank canvas upon which they could project their own divinity. They were tired of being at the mercy of nature. They were done with being subjects of a god who could wipe them out. It was time for a new regime, a human regime, and for that, they needed a leader who was more than a man. They needed a titan. Out of the lineage of Ham rose a figure of immense power and darker ambition, Nimrod. The ancient texts describe him as a mighty hunter before the Lord, but the translation fails to capture the predatory nature of his rule. He was the first potentate, the first man to centralize power into a fist of iron. Legend whispers that Nimrod possessed a relic of the old world, the original garments of skin that God had fashioned for Adam and Eve in the garden. When Nimrod donned these ancient clothes, the animals of the field would prostrate themselves before him, and men, seeing his dominion over nature, began to worship him as a god-king. He stood before the gathering masses in Shinar, a giant of a man draped in the artifacts of Eden, and he preyed upon their trauma. He spoke to their fear of the water. He told them that God was a capricious tyrant who had drowned their ancestors, and that their only safety lay in their own strength. He proposed a project of insanity and genius, a city that would act as a fortress for all mankind, and a tower with its top in the heavens. This wasn't just architecture, it was a declaration of war. He convinced them that if they could build high enough, they could pierce the firmament, survive any future flood, and perhaps even storm the gates of heaven itself to dethrone the Creator. The rallying cry was seductive in its arrogance. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The construction of Babel was an industrial nightmare of unprecedented scale. For the first time, humanity moved from using stone, which is God-made, irregular, and requires adaptation, to using brick, which is man-made, uniform, and identical. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. The smoke of the kilns blackened the sky over Shinar as millions of bricks were baked into hard, uniform blocks. They used bitumen for mortar, a black, sticky slime that bubbled up from the earth, cementing their rebellion together. Visualize the scene. The air is thick with the smell of sulfur and burning straw. The sound is a deafening, rhythmic cacophony of millions of people speaking one language, moving in perfect, ant-like synchronization. There was no individuality here, only the collective. If a brick fell and broke, the workers wept for the loss of progress. If a man fell and died, he was simply kicked aside, replaced by another cog in the machine. Nimrod oversaw it all, his gaze fixed on the clouds, his heart swelling with a hubris that threatened to crack the foundations of reality. The tower rose, layer by layer, a jagged scar reaching up to stab the sky, a monument to human pride that screamed, "We do not need you." But in the shadow of this monolithic rebellion, a resistance began to form. Not an army, but a single man with a dangerous idea. Abraham, then known as Abram, stood apart from the collective psychosis. While his father, Terah, manufactured idols to sell to the superstitious masses, Abraham looked at the stars and realized that the statues were nothing but wood and stone. The confrontation was inevitable. Abraham was brought before Nimrod, the self-proclaimed god of the earth. The atmosphere was electric, a courtroom drama where the defendant was the only sane man in an asylum. Nimrod, seated on a throne of gold, looked down at the young iconoclast and demanded submission. "Worship the fire," Nimrod commanded, "for it consumes all." Abraham replied, "Then I should worship water, which quenches fire." Nimrod, annoyed, countered, "Then worship water." Abraham parried, "Then I should worship the clouds, which carry the water." Nimrod, patience fraying, growled, "Worship the clouds, then." Abraham continued, "Then I should worship the wind, which scatters the clouds." Nimrod, furious, slammed his fist, "Then worship the wind." Abraham smiled, "Then I should worship man, who withstands the wind." Nimrod had lost the debate. His logic was circular, his gods were finite. In a rage, he abandoned logic for violence. "I worship fire," Nimrod roared, "and I will cast you into it. Let the God you worship come and save you." The furnace was stoked until it roared like a beast, the heat so intense it scorched the eyebrows of the guards. Abraham was bound and thrown into the heart of the inferno. The crowds watched, breathless, expecting the screams of a dying man. But instead, they saw Abraham walking amidst the flames, untouched, his bonds burned away, but his skin cool, as if he were strolling in a garden of roses. The fire recognized its master, and it was not Nimrod. Watching from the sidelines was Haran, Abraham's brother. His heart was a pendulum of doubt. He told himself, "If Abraham wins, I am with Abraham. If Nimrod wins, I am with Nimrod." He was the archetype of the fence-sitter, the lukewarm believer who wants the safety of the winner without the risk of faith. When Abraham emerged alive, Haran shouted, "I am with Abraham." Nimrod seized him and cast him into the fire. But Haran had no faith of his own. He was borrowing his brother's. The flames consumed him instantly, and he died in the presence of his father, a tragic monument to the danger of half-hearted conviction. Nimrod, humiliated but unbroken, doubled down on his rebellion. He declared war on the heavens. But God did not send a legion of angels with flaming swords to fight him. He did not send an earthquake or a lightning bolt. He sent a gnat. A single microscopic insect flew into Nimrod's nose and burrowed into his brain. The great hunter, the king of the earth, the builder of the tower, was brought to his knees by a bug. For years, the gnat buzzed incessantly inside his skull, a torture so maddening that Nimrod would pay servants to strike his head with mallets just to drown out the sound. The man who tried to build a tower to replace God was driven insane by the smallest of God's creations, a living irony that gnawed at his mind until his death. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the true judgment arrived. God looked down at the unity of mankind and said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." This was not a statement of fear, but of concern. Humanity united in evil is an unstoppable force of destruction. So God said, "Let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." In an instant, the neural pathways of millions were rewired. The foreman yelled for mortar, but the worker heard wood. The architect called for reinforcement, but the builder heard demolition. Confusion erupted. The perfect rhythm of the construction site dissolved into chaos. Frustration turned to anger, and anger turned to violence. The tools that built the tower became weapons of war. "Come, let us go down and confuse their language." The project stalled. The great tower, half finished, stood as a jagged tombstone to human arrogance. The people, no longer bound by a common tongue, fractured into tribes and nations. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. They migrated outward, carrying their new languages and their broken pride, spreading to the corners of the globe, not by choice, but by necessity. The city was named Babel, a word that would forever mean confusion, the place where God humbled the collective ego of the species. The unity of the hive mind was shattered, replaced by the diversity of nations, a divine quarantine to prevent the cancer of sin from metastasizing into a single, unstoppable tumor. The story of Babel leaves us with a haunting realization about the nature of technology and progress. We assume that if we can just communicate perfectly, if we can just connect everyone, if we can just build a platform big enough, we will solve the human condition. But Babel teaches us that connection without character is a recipe for disaster. The subversive twist here is that the curse of different languages was actually a blessing. God shattered our unity to save us from our own totalitarian potential. If humanity had remained one under one tyrant like Nimrod, with one ideology, there would have been no escape, no diversity of thought, no place for a man like Abraham to hear a different voice. The scattering preserved the possibility of freedom. This creates a terrifying mirror for our modern world. We are rebuilding Babel. We have created a digital plane of Shinar called the Internet. We have a universal language of binary code. We are striving for a global consciousness, a hive mind, where everyone thinks the same, cancels the same dissenters, and worships the same idols of celebrity and self. We are building a tower to the heavens, trying to upload our consciousness and become gods. And just like Nimrod, we think we are invincible. So here is the binary question that the ruins of Babel force you to answer. Do you want a world of perfect unity, where everyone speaks with one voice, but that voice belongs to a tyrant? Or do you choose the chaos of diversity, where we struggle to understand each other, but in that struggle, we remain free? The tower has fallen, and the nations have been scattered. But out of this chaos, God is about to do something quiet. He is done with the masses. He is done with the empires. He is going to zoom in on one old man in a pagan tent and whisper a promise that will change the molecular structure of history. The era of the generals is over. The era of the patriarchs has begun. Subscribe now, because Abraham is about to light a fire that no Nimrod can put out. History is usually written by the conquerors, the builders of towers, and the kings who carve their names into granite. But the next chapter of the human story does not begin in a palace or a war room. It begins in a vacuum of silence, with a man who was asked to commit career suicide. In the aftermath of Babel, while nations were scrambling to secure territory and forge identities, God zoomed in on a single, nondescript tent in the pagan city of Ur. He bypassed the generals and the geniuses to find a man named Abram. This was not a young revolutionary. This was a man settled in his ways, living in the epicenter of civilization. Ur was comfortable, advanced, and idolatrous. Yet the voice of the Creator pierced through the noise of the city, not with a clap of thunder, but with a terrifyingly quiet command: "Get out." The instruction was a masterclass in ambiguity. Leave your country, your family, and your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Note the lack of coordinates. There was no map, no GPS, no destination. Just a command to sever every tie of security and walk into the blank space of the unknown. The departure of Abraham is the first great leap of faith in the cosmic record. Imagine the scene: a man packing his life away, dismantling his home, while his neighbors watched with a mix of pity and confusion. "Where are you going, Abram?" "I don't know." "Why are you leaving?" "A voice told me to." In the eyes of the world, he was a lunatic. He was trading the concrete certainty of Ur for the fluid danger of the wilderness. He left his past, his heritage, and his reputation, carrying only a promise that seemed biologically impossible. God had said, "I will make you a great nation, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." But there was a cruel irony in this promise. Abraham was old, and his wife Sarah was barren. Her womb was a tomb, a place where life could not take root. To promise a great nation to a sterile couple was not just paradoxical. It felt like a divine mockery. Yet Abraham walked. He walked away from the logic of men and into the logic of God, beginning a journey that would redefine the spiritual DNA of the species. For 25 years, the promise hung over them like a ghost. They walked through deserts, faced famines, and navigated the politics of foreign kings, all while the silence of the womb grew louder. Abraham looked at the stars, as God had commanded, trying to count them, trying to visualize his descendants, but all he saw was the empty vastness of space. The psychological toll of this waiting cannot be overstated. It drove them to desperation. Sarah, crushed by the shame of infertility, engineered a human solution, offering her servant Hagar to Abraham. It was a lapse in faith, a frantic attempt to help God out, and it resulted in the birth of Ishmael. But Ishmael was the child of the flesh, not the child of the promise. God was not interested in what Abraham could produce through his own effort. He was interested in the impossible. Finally, when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, when their bodies were as good as dead, the biological laws were suspended. Sarah conceived. The laughter that filled their tent when Isaac was born was not just joy. It was the sound of logic breaking. They named him Isaac, meaning laughter, a living testament that God gets the last laugh over the constraints of nature. But the story does not end with a nursery rhyme. It spirals into a psychological horror that remains the most difficult passage in religious history. The boy grew. Isaac became the center of Abraham's world, the physical proof of every prayer answered, the heir to the galaxy of stars promised in the night sky. And then the voice returned. It had been years since God spoke with such clarity, and when he did, the words were like a knife to the chest. Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. The command was a shattering of the moral universe. This was the God who hated the child sacrifices of the pagan nations. Yet here he was, demanding the very same thing. It was a contradiction that threatened to destroy Abraham's mind. Why give the miraculous boy only to demand his slaughter? It made no sense. It was cruel. It was absurd. Abraham did not argue. The text records no scream of protest, no bargaining, no delay. So Abraham rose early in the morning. The silence of that morning must have been suffocating. He saddled his donkey, split the wood for the burnt offering, and woke his son. The journey to Mount Moriah took 3 days. 3 days of walking next to the child he was going to kill. 3 days to think, to turn back, to curse God. Every step was a funeral march. Isaac, innocent and unaware, walked beside a father who was carrying a secret that was tearing him apart from the inside out. As they approached the mountain, Abraham told his servants to stay behind, uttering a statement of faith that defies comprehension. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. We will come back. In the darkness of his agony, Abraham had reasoned that if God was going to kill the promise, God would have to resurrect the promise. He believed in a resurrection before he had ever seen one. The climb up Mount Moriah is the most tense ascent in literature. The geography is steep, the air thinning, the sun beating down on the rocks. Isaac carrying the wood on his back, a chilling foreshadowing of another son who would carry a wooden beam up a hill, broke the silence. My father, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? The question must have pierced Abraham's heart. He couldn't look the boy in the eye. He looked at the horizon, his voice trembling but steady. My son, God will provide for himself the lamb. It was a hope, a prayer, a desperate prophecy. They reached the summit. The moment of truth had arrived. There was no lamb. Abraham built the altar, stone by heavy stone. He laid the wood in order. And then the unthinkable. He bound Isaac. The text does not record a struggle. Isaac, young and strong, could have easily overpowered the 100-year-old man. But he didn't. He submitted. The son laid down on the wood, a willing sacrifice. The camera zooms in on the hand of the father. Abraham reached out and took the knife. The sunlight glinted off the blade. This was not a bluff. This was not a drill. In his heart, the boy was already dead. Abraham's muscles tensed, his arm raised, ready to plunge the steel into the chest of the miracle he had waited a century to hold. The universe held its breath. And then a voice exploded from the heavens, shattering the silence. Abraham! Abraham! The old man froze, the knife hovering inches from the boy's throat. Do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. The test was over. Abraham collapsed, the adrenaline draining from his shaking body. He looked up, and there, caught in a thicket by its horns, was a ram. A substitute. God had indeed provided. The ram died, Isaac lived. The blood that stained the altar that day was the blood of a substitute, provided by God himself. Abraham named that place Jehovah-Jireh. The Lord will provide. But the Hebrew has a deeper nuance. On the mountain of the Lord it shall be seen. What was seen? A father willing to sacrifice his beloved son, a son willing to submit to the father, and a God who provides a substitute to stop the death. As they walked down the mountain, Abraham and Isaac were changed men. The covenant was sealed not just in words, but in the willingness to give up the ultimate treasure. God reaffirmed the promise. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. The lineage was secured. From this traumatized but triumphant family would come Jacob, Joseph, and eventually the Savior of the world. But the shadow of Moriah would linger over history, a haunting reminder that true faith is not just believing God for a blessing, but trusting God with the thing you love the most. The story of Abraham and Isaac is the ultimate subversion of the transactional God myth. In the ancient world, you sacrificed to the gods to get something: rain, harvest, victory. You paid the bribe, and the god delivered the goods. But here, the dynamic is flipped. Abraham isn't sacrificing to get something. He is sacrificing the very thing he already has. This reveals a terrifying truth. God is not interested in being a part of your life. He demands to be the center of it. He is a jealous lover who will not share the throne of your heart, even with his own gifts. The irony here is breathtaking. Abraham had to be willing to kill the promise to keep the promiser. If he had chosen Isaac over God, he would have lost both. By choosing God over Isaac, he got to keep both. This is the subversive twist. The things we try to grasp, we lose. The things we surrender, we get to keep. The knife was never meant for the boy. It was meant for the idol in Abraham's heart. God didn't want Isaac's blood. He wanted Abraham's trust. This brings us to the contemporary mirror. We all have an Isaac. It might not be a child. It might be your career, your reputation, your relationship, or your dream. It is that one thing that, if God asked for it back, you would say, anything but that. That is your idol. That is your Isaac. And until you are willing to lay it on the altar, you are a slave to it. We live in a culture that worships blessings. We want the success, the miracle, the breakthrough. But we are terrified of the giver, because the giver is dangerous. The giver carries a knife. So here is the binary question that Mount Moriah forces you to answer. Do you love the gift, or do you love the giver? If the gift was taken away tomorrow, if the health failed, the money vanished, the relationship ended, would you still worship on the mountain? Or is your faith dependent on the goods being delivered? Abraham passed the test, and the ram took the fall. But the mountain is still there. Moriah is waiting. And centuries later, another father will walk up that same hill with his son. But that time, there will be no ram in the thicket. That time, the knife will fall. The story of the bloodline continues, but now it splits. Two brothers are about to enter the stage, and their war will birth nations. Esau is hunting, Jacob is cooking, and a bowl of stew is about to cost a man his soul. Subscribe and ring the bell, because the birthright is for sale. We are told that the world belongs to the strong, to the swift, to the hunters who dominate the field and take what they want by force. But the story of the patriarchs takes a sharp, subversive turn, revealing that the destiny of nations is not determined by muscle but by desire. We leave the high drama of Mount Moriah and enter the intimate, suffocating tension of a family tent, where a war is brewing not between armies, but between brothers. This war did not begin on a battlefield. It began in the womb. Rebekah, the wife of Isaac, felt a violent struggle within her, a biological clash so intense she cried out to God, wondering if she would survive the pregnancy. The divine answer was a prophecy that would shatter the natural order. 2 nations are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. This was a declaration of spiritual insurrection. In the ancient world, the firstborn was king, the priest, the heir. But God was rewriting the script before the actors even stepped onto the stage. When the twins were born, the first was Esau, red, hairy, a visceral creature of the earth. But clutching his heel, refusing to let go, was the second, Jacob. His name meant the supplanter, the heel-grabber, the trickster. From his first breath, Jacob was fighting for a position that biology had denied him. As the boys grew, the divide became a chasm. Esau was a man of the field, a skillful hunter who smelled of blood and soil, the favorite of his father Isaac, who had a taste for wild game. Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents, a man of intellect and strategy, the favorite of his mother. The tension simmered until it boiled over in a moment that stands as the most expensive meal in human history. Esau returned from the field one day, exhausted, famished, his body screaming for sustenance. He found Jacob cooking a red stew, a thick, aromatic pottage. The smell hit Esau like a drug. "Feed me some of that red stuff," he demanded, "for I am weary." Jacob, the cold calculator, saw his opening. He didn't offer charity, he offered a trade. "Sell me your birthright as of this day." The birthright was the spiritual and material double portion, the leadership of the clan, the priesthood of the family. It was priceless. But Esau, ruled by the tyranny of his immediate appetite, sneered at the future. "Look, I am about to die, so what is this birthright to me?" He swore an oath, ate the stew, wiped his mouth, and walked away. The text delivers a crushing verdict. Thus Esau despised his birthright. He traded the eternal for the temporary, a kingdom for a bowl of soup. But the transaction in the field was only the prelude to the heist in the tent. Years later, Isaac was old, his eyes dim with blindness, his body failing. He sensed the end was near and called for Esau to hunt some game and prepare a meal so he could bestow the patriarchal blessing, the irrevocable transfer of divine power, before he died. Rebekah, the silent architect of history, overheard the plan. She knew the prophecy. She knew the blessing belonged to Jacob. She mobilized her son in a high-stakes conspiracy. "Go to the flock," she commanded. "Bring me 2 young goats." She would prepare the meal, but the disguise was the danger. "Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man," Jacob argued, terrified. "If my father touches me, I shall seem to be a deceiver to him, and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." Rebekah took the curse upon herself. She took the garments of Esau, heavy with the scent of the outdoors, and put them on Jacob. She took the skins of the goats, rough, hairy, animalistic, and bound them to his hands and the smooth of his neck. Jacob entered the darkness of his father's tent, carrying the savory meat and a lie that could get him killed. "I am Esau, your firstborn," he announced. Isaac, blind but sharp, hesitated. The voice was wrong. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He called the boy closer. The tension in that small space was suffocating. Jacob leaned in, the goat skins brushing against the old man's trembling fingers. Isaac smelled the clothes, the authentic scent of the field that Esau carried, and his doubt dissolved. He ate, he drank, and then he unleashed the blessing. It was a torrent of prophetic power. "Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren." Jacob absorbed the words, stealing the destiny of the firstborn. He had barely left the room when the real Esau returned. The realization of what had happened shattered the family. Isaac trembled violently, a deep, guttural shaking of shock. Esau let out a cry that was bitter and exceedingly loud. "Bless me, me also, O my father." But the chamber was empty. The blessing was spent. "Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing." Esau's grief calcified into a cold, murderous rage. "The days of mourning for my father are at hand," he whispered to himself. "Then I will kill my brother Jacob." Jacob became a fugitive. He fled to the land of Haran, to the house of his uncle Laban, a man who would become his mirror and his tormentor. On the way, alone in the wilderness, with a stone for a pillow, the heavens opened. Jacob dreamed of a ladder set up on the earth, its top reaching to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. Above it stood the Lord, confirming that the stolen blessing was now ratified by heaven. "I am with you and will keep you wherever you go." Jacob woke up trembling, anointed the stone, and made a vow. He arrived in Haran not as a prince, but as a refugee. There he met Rachel, a woman of striking beauty, and fell in love instantly. He struck a deal with Laban, 7 years of labor for her hand in marriage. The text says the 7 years seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. But Laban was a master deceiver, a professional grifter who recognized a fellow con artist. On the wedding night, under the cover of heavy veils and darkness, Laban swapped the sisters. He gave Jacob the older, dull-eyed Leah instead of the radiant Rachel. When the morning light hit the tent, Jacob stared into the face of the wrong woman. "What is this you have done to me?" he screamed. Laban smiled, a cold, ironic smile. "It is not our custom to give the younger before the firstborn." The trickster had been tricked. The man who exploited his brother's blindness was exploited by the darkness of the night. Jacob was forced to work another 7 years for Rachel. 14 years of sweat, heat, and servitude to pay for the woman he loved. But the ultimate confrontation was yet to come. After 20 years, Jacob fled Laban and headed home, straight into the path of the brother who had sworn to kill him. Reports came in. Esau was coming to meet him, and he had 400 men with him. This was not a welcome party. It was a hit squad. Jacob was terrified. He sent waves of gifts ahead, trying to buy his survival. But that night, at the ford of the Jabbok, he sent his family across the river and stayed behind. He was left alone, and there, in the pitch black, a man wrestled with him. This was no ordinary brawl. It was a primal, supernatural combat that lasted for hours. Jacob fought with everything he had, his guilt, his fear, his past. He grappled with this mysterious stranger in the dust and mud of the riverbank, refusing to yield. As dawn approached, the stranger saw that Jacob would not quit, so he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. The joint dislocated instantly, a crippling injury. Yet even in agony, clinging to the stranger with a broken body, Jacob gasped, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The stranger asked a question that cut to the core of his identity. "What is your name?" For his whole life, he had been the deceiver, the pretender, the one who said, "I am Esau." Now he had to confess. "I am Jacob," he admitted. "I am the cheat. I am the heel grabber." And in that moment of confession, the transformation happened. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." He was given a new identity. He was no longer defined by his deception, but by his struggle. The sun rose on him as he limped across the river, physically broken, but spiritually whole. He met Esau not as a cowering thief, but as a prince of God. And when Esau saw him, the man of war did not draw his sword. He ran. He fell on his brother's neck and kissed him. They wept. The hatred that had been born in the womb and hardened by betrayal was dissolved in a moment of grace. The brothers were reconciled, but history had been irrevocably altered. The lineage of the promise would flow through the limp of the younger brother, the man who wrestled with God and lived to tell the tale. The story of Jacob is a masterclass in the scandal of grace. We are conditioned to believe that God chooses the good people, the honest, the brave, the noble. But in this story, God bypasses the man's man, the loyal son, the rugged hunter Esau, and chooses the liar, the manipulator, the mama's boy. Why? This seems to violate every principle of fairness. But here is the subversive twist. God did not choose Jacob because he was good. God chose Jacob because he wanted it. Esau was good in a worldly sense, but he was indifferent to spiritual things. He treated the birthright like a piece of trash to be traded for a hot meal. Jacob was flawed, deeply flawed, but he valued the blessing enough to lie for it, to work for it, to fight for it, and to wrestle God for it. God prefers a limping wrestler who is desperate for his presence over a competent moralist who doesn't need him. This mirrors our modern obsession with fairness versus desire. We look at successful people and say, they don't deserve that. We look at our own lives and say, I'm a good person. Why isn't God blessing me? The story of Jacob slaps us in the face with the reality that being good is often just a mask for being passive. Esau was passive about his destiny. Jacob was aggressive. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. This leads to a terrifying realization about the wrestling match. We spend our lives trying to avoid pain, trying to avoid the struggle. We want the blessing without the dislocated hip. But the story tells us that you cannot be renamed Israel until you have been broken. The limp is the trophy. The scar is the proof of the encounter. If you are walking without a limp, maybe you haven't wrestled with God yet. Maybe you're still just Jacob. So here is the binary question that the river Jabbok forces you to answer. Do you want a life of comfort, where you walk straight and strong, but never know the face of God? Or do you choose the wrestling match, where you end up broken and limping, but you walk away with a new name? Jacob has his new name, and the 12 tribes are born. But the drama of this dysfunctional family is far from over. The spotlight is about to shift to a young dreamer in a coat of many colors. He is the favorite son, and his brothers are sharpening their knives. The pit is dug, the merchants are coming, and the greatest detective story in the Bible is about to begin. Subscribe now, because Joseph is about to be sold down the river, and the fate of the world goes with him. We often romanticize the concept of a dreamer. We see them as visionaries, harmless optimists with their heads in the clouds. But in the ancient world, a dreamer was a dangerous anomaly. A man who saw the future was a threat to the present, a disruption to the hierarchy, and a target for destruction. The story of Joseph is not a fairy tale of rags to riches. It is a brutal, cinematic saga of human trafficking, sexual politics, political maneuvering, and the terrifying sovereignty of God. It begins in the dysfunctional pressure cooker of Jacob's camp, where the trauma of the previous generation has metastasized into a toxic favoritism. Jacob, the man who was once the disregarded younger brother, now commits the sin of his father by choosing a favorite son. He loved Joseph, the son of his old age, the firstborn of his beloved Rachel, more than all his other children. And he didn't hide it. He weaponized his affection by crafting a coat of many colors, a ketonet passim. This was not just a flamboyant jacket. It was a princely robe, a garment with long sleeves that signaled exemption from manual labor. While his 10 older brothers sweated in the fields, smelling of sheep and manure, Joseph walked in the cool of the tent, draped in a rainbow of privilege. The coat was a daily visual reminder that they were second-class citizens in their own family. The hatred of the brothers was a slow-burning fire, fueled by Joseph's lack of social awareness. He didn't just wear the coat, he shared the dreams. He told them of sheaves of wheat in the field, their sheaves, bowing down to his. He told them of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrating themselves before him. To the brothers, this wasn't prophecy. It was treason. It was a declaration that the baby of the family intended to rule over them. The rage reached a boiling point at Dothan. Jacob, blind to the danger, sent Joseph to check on his brothers. As they saw him approaching from a distance, the colors of his robe shimmering in the heat haze, the murder plot was hatched instantly. "Here comes this dreamer," they sneered. "Come now, let us kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." Reuben, the eldest, tried to mitigate the violence, suggesting they throw him in a pit but not kill him, secretly planning a rescue. But when Joseph arrived, the mob mentality took over. They didn't greet him, they assaulted him. The text implies a visceral violence. They stripped him of his robe. Imagine the sound of the fabric tearing, the symbol of his father's love being ripped from his body. They dragged him to a dry cistern and threw him into the darkness. And then, in a detail of chilling callousness, they sat down to eat a meal. They chewed bread while their brother screamed for mercy from the bottom of the well. But death was too simple a fate. A caravan of Ishmaelites appeared on the horizon, camels laden with spices and balms bound for Egypt. Judah, the fourth son, proposed a pivot from murder to profit. What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation. They pulled Joseph up, a rebirth from the earth, not into freedom, but into slavery, and sold him for 20 pieces of silver, the price of a boy's life. They took the hated coat, dipped it in the blood of a goat, a cruel echo of the goat skins Jacob had used to deceive his own father, and sent it back to the patriarch. Jacob recognized the bloody fabric and collapsed in grief, concluding that a wild beast had devoured his son. He refused to be comforted, descending into a mourning that would last for decades. Meanwhile, Joseph was chained, dragged across the burning sands of the Sinai, stripped of his name, his rights, and his future. He arrived in Egypt not as a prince, but as a commodity. He was purchased by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, a man who dealt in death and security. In the shadow of the pyramids, Joseph faced a choice: succumb to the bitterness of his betrayal or execute his duties with excellence. He chose the latter. The favor of God, an invisible but tangible force, accompanied him. Everything he touched turned to gold. Potiphar watched this young Hebrew slave with amazement. The household ran with a supernatural efficiency. Soon, Joseph was no longer a slave in practice, but the master of the estate. He held the keys to everything, except one thing: Potiphar's wife. She was a woman of power and appetite, and she fixed her eyes on Joseph. He was handsome in form and appearance, and she pursued him with a predatory relentlessness. Day after day she whispered, "Lie with me." It was the ultimate test of integrity. No one would know. He was a slave. He had no rights to refuse. Yet Joseph refused, drawing a line in the sand of his conscience. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? One day the house was empty. She cornered him, grabbing his garment. The second time a piece of clothing would determine his fate. He pulled away so violently that he left the cloak in her hands and fled naked into the daylight. Humiliated and rejected, she weaponized the evidence. She screamed rape, waving the garment as proof. Potiphar, caught between his trusted servant and his wife's honor, threw Joseph into the king's prison. The dungeon was a hole of silence. For Joseph, it must have felt like God was mocking him. He had done the right thing, the moral thing, and his reward was a darker pit than the first one. But even in the sewage and the gloom, the anomaly of Joseph's character shone. The keeper of the prison saw what Potiphar had seen. Soon, Joseph was running the prison. It was here, in the waiting room of the forgotten, that the dreams returned. Not his dreams, but the nightmares of others. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker were thrown into the cell. One night they dreamed. The cupbearer saw a vine with 3 branches, blossoming into grapes, which he pressed into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interpreted, "In 3 days you will be restored." The baker saw 3 baskets of bread on his head, with birds eating the food. Joseph, with a heavy heart, interpreted, "In 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head." The predictions were surgically accurate. The cupbearer was restored. The baker was executed. Joseph had asked only one thing of the cupbearer: "Remember me when it is well with you." But the text delivers a crushing blow. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. 2 full years passed, 730 days of staring at a stone wall, wondering if the God of his fathers had lost his address. Then the disturbance moved from the prison to the palace. Pharaoh, the living god of Egypt, had a nightmare that shook him to his core. He stood by the Nile and saw 7 fat, sleek cows emerge from the river. Then 7 gaunt, skeletal cows came up and devoured the fat ones, yet remained just as thin. He woke, slept again, and saw 7 plump heads of grain devoured by 7 withered, blighted heads. The morning brought panic. The magicians and wise men of Egypt were summoned, but their occult arts failed. The silence of the sages terrified the court. It was then, in the vacuum of answers, that the cupbearer's memory finally triggered. "I remember my faults this day," he confessed. He told Pharaoh of the Hebrew youth in the dungeon. Joseph was summoned. They shaved him, changed his clothes, and brought him before the most powerful man on earth. Pharaoh looked at the slave and said, "I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it." Joseph's response was a masterpiece of humility and boldness. "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Joseph dismantled the dream. The 7 fat cows and heads of grain were 7 years of great abundance. The 7 gaunt cows and withered heads were 7 years of devastating famine that would swallow the land. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. But Joseph didn't stop at the diagnosis. He offered the cure. He laid out a national economic policy, a flat tax of 20% during the good years to build a strategic grain reserve. Pharaoh, recognizing the Spirit of God in this young man, made an unprecedented decision. He took the signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's. He dressed him in linen and put a gold chain around his neck. "Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." In 1 hour, Joseph went from a prisoner with a number to the prime minister of the world. He was 30 years old. He traveled the land, building massive storehouses, preparing for the apocalypse. And when the 7 years of plenty ended, the sky turned to brass, and the earth cracked open. The famine was severe, but in Egypt there was bread. The hunger spread like a plague, reaching the hills of Canaan. Jacob, looking at his starving sons, asked, "Why do you stand looking at one another? Go down to Egypt and buy grain." 10 brothers, the same 10 who had sold Joseph, made the trek. They arrived in Egypt, dusted with the grit of the journey, and were brought before the governor of the land. They bowed with their faces to the earth. The dream of the sheaves had come true. Joseph recognized them instantly. The rush of emotion must have been overwhelming. Rage, grief, vindication. But they did not know him. He was an Egyptian prince, speaking through an interpreter, shaved and painted. Joseph decided to test them, not to torture them, but to see if they were the same men. He accused them of being spies. He threw them in prison for 3 days. He listened as they whispered to each other in Hebrew. Unaware, he understood every word. We are truly guilty concerning our brother. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. He saw their regret. He kept Simeon as a hostage and sent the rest back with grain, demanding they return with Benjamin, the youngest, the only other son of Rachel. The famine persisted. The grain ran out. The brothers had to return, this time with Benjamin, despite Jacob's terrified resistance. When they arrived, Joseph feasted with them, seating them in birth order, which bewildered them. He piled Benjamin's plate with 5 times the food. But the final test was yet to come. As they left for Canaan, Joseph ordered his silver divination cup to be hidden in Benjamin's sack. He sent his steward to chase them down. The accusation was made. The sacks were searched. One by one, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, until they reached the youngest. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers tore their clothes. This was the nightmare scenario, losing Rachel's other son. They were hauled back to Joseph. They fell to the ground. Joseph demanded that Benjamin remain as a slave. And then the miracle happened. It wasn't a parting of the sea, it was a parting of the heart. Judah, the very man who had suggested selling Joseph into slavery 20 years ago, stepped forward. He delivered the most moving speech in the Old Testament. He explained his father's grief, the loss of the other son, and the fatal blow this would strike to the old man. And then he offered the trade. Please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. Judah offered his life for his brother. The transformation was complete. The selfish, violent men had become sacrificial. Joseph could contain himself no longer. "Make everyone go out from me," he cried. The Egyptians left. He stood alone with his brothers. A wail escaped his throat, so loud the household of Pharaoh heard it. "I am Joseph." The brothers were petrified. They were standing before the judge of the world, the man they had murdered in their hearts. But Joseph did not strike. He wept. "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." He reframed their sin within the sovereignty of God. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." He embraced Benjamin, weeping on his neck. He kissed all his brothers. The reconciliation was absolute. The family was summoned to Egypt. Jacob, hearing the news, felt his heart stop, then revive. "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." The migration began. 70 souls moved to Goshen, the fertile delta of the Nile. The nation of Israel was incubated in the womb of Egypt, protected by the brother they had rejected. The story of Joseph is the ultimate narrative of retroactive redemption. We live our lives forward, but we understand them backward. When Joseph was in the pit, it was a tragedy. When he was in the prison, it was an injustice. But when he stood in the palace, the pit and the prison were revealed to be the necessary steps on the staircase to salvation. This leads to a subversive twist. The villains of the story, the brothers, Potiphar's wife, the forgetful cupbearer, were actually the unconscious agents of God's deliverance. Without the betrayal, there is no Egypt. Without the prison, there is no interpretation. Without the famine, the family starves in Canaan. The evil was not just defeated, it was employed. It was the raw material God used to manufacture the good. This creates a contemporary mirror for us. We are obsessed with blocking negative energy, canceling toxic people, and avoiding pain. We think that if something goes wrong, the plan has failed. But Joseph's life argues that the wrong turns are part of the map. That setback you are mourning, that betrayal you are nursing, that silence you are enduring. It is not a detour. It is the transport system to your destiny. You are not buried. You are planted. So here is the binary question that the palace of Pharaoh forces you to answer. Do you trust the author only when the chapter is happy? Or do you have the grit to trust him when the plot twists into the dark, believing that the final page will justify the pain of the middle chapters? Joseph dies at 110 years old. He is embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. But before he closes his eyes, he gives a command. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. He knew Egypt was not the end. The book of Genesis closes with a coffin, a full stop in a foreign land. The stage goes dark. The silence will last for 400 years. The heroes are dead, the memories are fading, and a new Pharaoh is rising who does not know Joseph. The era of the patriarchs is over. The era of the slaves is about to begin. But in the reeds of the Nile, a baby is about to cry. Subscribe and ring the bell, because the water is turning to blood and the Exodus is coming.